Hello again, friends. Jonathan Rogers. If you didn't hear me say it on last week's episode, I'm giving away a free mini course to help you get started on a new writing project. This content was originally a part of our writer development cohorts, but I'm giving it away this season as a way to help people with some of the greatest challenges when it comes to writing. You can get it by going to thehabit.co/development. Go to thehabit.co/development, enter your email address, and you'll start getting a series of 3 lectures. And after you go through it, I want to hear from you. What helped you? Did you have any breakthroughs in your creative process? We'll be kicking off our next writer development cohort mid-January of 2026. I'll have more info on that for you later. For now, go to thehabit.co/development.
There is nothing that can inspire a human imagination like opening a book. That's what books mean to us.
Yeah.
And that's our inheritance. And we can pass that on to our kids, and we can encourage it in others and celebrate that.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. I've known Joel Miller for about 20 years. For more than half of that time, off and on, he's been working on a book that has finally found its way into the world. It's called The Idea Machine: How Books Built Our World and Shape Our Future. It's a fascinating history of the book as a technology, but it's a lot more than that. This episode of the Habit Podcast was recorded live as part of a book release celebration at the Rabbit Room's Northwind Manor. Joel's new book is The Idea Machine. It's a book that I'm going to let Joel give his 90-second version of what this book is, but I'll give you my 45-second version, and that is it's a book about books. As Joel was saying earlier, it started out as something like 13 years ago as a history of the book, but he kept realizing there's lots of histories of the book, and he was really looking for his entree to really what he wanted to say about the book, and kind of where he landed and what makes this book really interesting and really compelling is that the book is an information technology. We don't think of it as a technology, but it's a technology that has really made what we think of as civilization possible. Right? People have always passed along knowledge from generation to generation. The tradition is handing things on, but when we were able to write things down and save them in books, that completely changed the way knowledge got passed along. There's your little introduction. Thanks for being here, Joel. This is really, really exciting. So, yes, Joel Miller, thank you for being here. So let's. I'm going to start with the question that I typically start with, which is, give me the 90-second version of what this book is about, besides what I just said.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you saw the news today, but the Mint has just announced that the final penny has been minted. For me, the penny dropped on this book when I read in Augustine's Confessions, a moment that we are all familiar with. If you've read the Confessions, even if you haven't read the Confessions, this is like one of the most universally well-known passages in that book. Augustine is distraught. He's living in this villa with his friend Alypius, and he's just in, like, his soul is being tortured. And he retreats to a garden there, and he brings with him a codex of Paul's letters, St. Paul's letters. And this book that he has in his hands, he sets down on a bench, and he goes off to basically weep under a tree because there's just no solace for him. And as he goes over to this tree to sit down and weep, he doesn't want Alypius to see him crying. He hears over the wall of this garden these children saying, "Take and read, tolle lege." And he then immediately thinks, my book. He goes back, picks up St. Paul's letters, opens the book at random, and lands on a passage that salves his spirit in that moment. And we're all familiar with that because of what the book did for him in that moment. It delivered a message to him that was uniquely meant for him at that moment. And we all interact with books in that way. But the penny dropped for me in the very next section of that telling that Augustine has, which is that he says, I closed the book, but I put like my finger or some marker in the book. And it was like a light bulb went off in my head, because I realized at that moment that the thinginess of the book played a unique role in that experience for him. The thingness of it, the fact that it was something that he could open at random, the fact that he could put his finger or a marker in that place and then show Alypius what he read. And then I just started to extrapolate from that. He can do that with lots of books. He can do that with multiple things in the same book. And that all of those marks in that book could create a lattice work for ideas, a scaffolding for new ideas to be pinned on. And it was like the technology of the book itself, the hardware of the book became a thing in my mind that I hadn't connected with before. And that's what the book is. It's a look at both the software of the book, all the ideas, all the content of the book and how that shapes us and has shaped us, but especially the hardware. And it's sort of the interplay of those two things that explains how our culture developed.
Yeah, it's not unusual for people to think about the way ideas passing from person to person, as memes, so to speak, as information that goes from person to person. And I guess you're calling the book a technology because of the hardware, not because of the software.
Well, the software too. It's a book is a unique tool for the conveyance of ideas. If you think about writing as a technique, the technology that makes use of that technique is the book. And so the ability to take what might be in the back of our minds, a fuzzy, gooey idea, and then turn it into something objective and firm on a page that can then scale to a mass readership is a unique feature of the human experience. And it's only because of the technology of the book that something like that is possible. Yeah.
So you've got you throughout the whole book, you have this model of an x-axis, a y-axis, and a z-axis.
Yeah.
So the act of writing, I might get the axes wrong.
That's right.
But you're getting more precise in the act of writing.
Yep.
A fuzzy idea becomes a specific idea.
Yep.
And then an obscure idea becomes a more public idea.
Yep.
That's the x and the y, or the y and the x. I'm not sure which is which. But then there's that third element, that third axis of time, the z-axis. Talk to me about any of those axes.
Well, so if you just walk through it with me, like just imagine a quadrant, like a graph in your head. Along the x-axis is the expression of an idea. And I may have, like we have right now, this idea, whatever I'm saying, I'm expressing it to you, it's available to you. I could speak very specifically about something that would drive it up the y-axis. And so in the upper quadrant, then you have an idea that is kind of like fully formed and fully expressed. Writing enables that to happen at a very precise level. If I speak to you, the odds that you will remember anything I say tonight are like greater than zero, but not much, let's be honest. So a public pronunciation of something, you might remember the gist of what I said. If I'm lucky, you'll remember the gist of what I said. Yeah. But writing puts it into a form that is persistent. And so suddenly a very precise version of an idea can persist across time. You can, if you actually get the book, you'll actually not have the gist of it, you'll have the fully formulated set of ideas that compose the book. So if you think about areas of human endeavor where that might matter, like law can't really exist without writing, because there are versions of law that can, but you cannot imagine something like a constitution or legal codes. In fact, that word code is important because that's a bookish reference. You cannot imagine those existing outside of the technology of the book. You could not have government without the book, or at least the state without the book. You can imagine governments working in kind of an anarcho-capitalist wonderland in which somehow that all worked. But you really couldn't have that work in any sort of sophisticated way without having the book. And that's true for science. It's true, think about theology. Think about the very precise formulations that go into the Nicene Creed and all the arguments that happen on the back end of that helped create that. Without the creed, you wouldn't be able to demand fidelity to a certain standard of belief. And yet that only happens because ultimately writing in the book.
Yeah. So good.
And then, of course, we have access to that millennia later now.
Yeah. And as you point out, in that along that z-axis of through the years, through the generations, through the millennia in some cases, on the one hand, the book solidifies a thought and captures it and makes it where it can't change.
Makes it a thing.
Yeah. On the other hand, it allows us to interact with that idea and interpret and actually, you finish that sentence.
Well, here's a great way to think about it. Ezra is bringing back a bunch of returnees from Babylon. And they're all sitting there in Israel, and they don't know which way is up, and he's going to set them straight. And so how's he going to do it? He is going to sit at a podium, at a dais, and recite the law to them. And so the people of Israel gather in front of him, and he's like now the new Moses, and he's going to basically read them. He's going to give them the law. But a lot of these people actually didn't speak Hebrew at that point. They'd been in captivity for a long time. A lot of them wouldn't understand the context in which those laws were given. And so it says in Nehemiah, where this story is told, that he distributed Levites among the people to explain the law to them. So they're hearing Ezra, but they actually have to have someone explain it to them. And that's a unique feature of the book in this persistence issue, that a book says what it says, but there's always the open question, well, what is that? And so you need someone to help explain. And this goes back even further. When Josiah is busy refurbishing the temple, Hilkiah goes to the chief priest as he's busy setting accounts and all this sort of stuff. And Hilkiah says, "You'll never believe this. We found this book." And he shows him, and he's blown away. Like, what is this book? And it turns out it's part of Deuteronomy. And he takes it back to Josiah, and he reads it, and Josiah rips his clothes. And, why would he do that? Because he realizes, oh my goodness, here is a standard to which we are not living, and we need to change. But, again, this is a very interesting side part of that story that I don't think most people pay attention to. Right after that, his clothes are in tatters and right there in front of him, but he realizes, I may have jumped the gun. What does it actually mean that we're not following this law? So they have to go to a prophetess who's in town to basically explain what they just read. So there's this feature of the book that it says what it says, but what it says is not always utterly clear. And therefore there needs to be like custodians of ideas or advocates for ideas that can speak to what the book says. And what that looks like practically in all sorts of settings is professors who teach books, or the leader of a rabbinic school who teaches out of a book, or a pastor who leads a congregation out of a book, or you can look at any area of expertise. There's going to be that. There's the received wisdom of maybe a certain body of knowledge. There needs to be interpreters of that.
Yeah. You talk about the fact that Socrates was suspicious of books.
Yes.
And we're going to circle back around to that at the end, toward the end. But one of his complaints about books is that it makes ideas, it kind of freezes them in time.
A book can only say the same thing multiple times.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And you can't query a book.
Yeah, but your point is we do it all the time. We query books all the time.
Yeah, we argue with them.
Yeah,
when I read a book, and I hope if you read mine that you do this. If you have anything that you disagree with, I hope you do. Write all over it. Like, have an argument with the book, because the book is there to have an argument with. Yeah. The book is there to grapple with. And so the book may not be able to say anything other than it says, but there are other resources that you can bring into it. You have your whole life experience. You have your own library behind you that you can pull a volume from and say, Joel says this on page 32, but Frank says this on page 92 of his book. And so Joel is clearly wrong. Yeah. That would be awesome. And that's how we ought to honestly be engaging with all of our books, even fiction.
Even fiction.
Yeah, why not?
Okay.
I mean, if you think about you're reading Middlemarch, and George Eliot is a wonderful aphorist. She's going to bring you I don't know what the kids say these days, truth bombs. Every few paragraphs, there's a great aphorism in Middlemarch, and some of them are true, and some of them may not be true.
Yeah.
You recognize it and be like, no, that's wrong.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, the topic that we kind of agreed from the jump that we're going to talk about is the idea that the act of writing is not just a matter of recording thoughts and ideas, but is is itself shapes the way, the act of writing shapes the way we think.
It's a form of thinking.
It's a form of thinking.
Yeah. I think this is like a really useful thing for people who are creative, who are writers, to recognize. You probably do recognize it just intuitively. But writing is actually thinking. And one of the ways that it's thinking is that when you write something, you have created now an object that you can critique. And writing naturally leads to editing, which fundamentally means writing leads to thinking. Mm-hmm. There's no way to not think. And this goes back in the literal archaeological record really far back. So, in Greece, they've got a lot of what you might call old stuff. And every now and then somebody starts working on something and they unearth something, that is an archaeological find. And here's an example of one. They found, while working on something that, there in the rubble or whatever, were these writing tablets that went back. I mean, they are like one of the earliest forms of written Greek, basically. And they're on these writing tablets, a technology that we can talk about as we go. But the way a writing tablet works is it's like a shingle of wood. It's like incised so that there's basically a dish, very, very shallow. And into that dish is poured hot wax, which then creates a smooth surface. So this is in a time where, there isn't paper. Papyrus is around, but it's difficult to come by, or it's slightly expensive. If you had to constantly be buying, new sheets, this would be a problem. Parchment is also available, but difficult to use compared to wax. So you basically fill this wooden panel with wax, and then you can use a stylus to write in it. And this tablet showed the work of this poet. We assume it's a woman, I think, referred to as the Attic poet. And she had not only written, but there are like editing marks right in the work. And so there's like a smudge out where she's written. It's like we do this with word processors all the time. We don't think about what a magical thing that is. Yeah. But the ability to write something and then go, no, it's wrong, and go back and fix it is a form of thinking. And so the very idea that you have takes better, fuller, more robust shape the more you work on it. Another example comes out of Ovid. In Ovid, he tells the story of the very unlucky Byblis. It turns out that she's in love with her brother, and he's not a fan of this new discovery, but she writes him a letter to try to like pour her heart out to him. And Ovid, as he's capturing this story, he talks about her writing, and he says that she starts and then stops. She thinks and then rethinks. And she strikes out and then she writes again. And those are gestures that telegraph someone internally thinking and rethinking an idea and trying to formulate it in its most persuasive way. And that is what we do when we write. And it's because of the nature of writing that it takes an idea, which is like the gooeyest, fuzziest thing that you can have. Like we think, following Francis Bacon, knowledge is power. Knowledge is like the flimsiest thing there is. Like you have 47 ideas before you even, get out of bed, and you forgot all of them by the time you make coffee. And so ideas themselves are actually very flimsy. Mm-hmm. It's actually when we take them and work them, and usually in some kind of written media, that they take real shape and real form. And so it's only that editorial process and being able to see the thing that enables you to critique it and refine it, that enables you to do that. So all of creative work depends on that ability.
Yeah, that's so interesting to think about turning it into a thing. This thing that's not a thing, that doesn't have any solidity, and then literally making it exist in the world. And that externalization is a big part of the way you talk about what writing is for. It's a thing that we can then kind of walk around and
yeah, you can look at it from different angles. You can manipulate it. You could say, that's a great idea, but actually I need to explain this other thing first before that thing even makes sense. Mm-hmm. And there's evidence of that even in writers like Quintilian in his Institution it's the Institutio Oratio, where he's describing what an orator ought to know. And so he's writing down here's how you think about writing, and to teach his students. And it's full of things like, you're going to have these preliminary ideas, and then you're going to give them firmer shape. you're going to, in the case of another writer at the time, Virgil, fairly famous, Virgil would basically dictate all morning to his scribe, his secretary, and then they would zhuzh and tweak all that content throughout the day so that he had like a final draft at the end of the day. And then he also talked about, he would say, like, put in stub verses in order to establish a thought so that what came into his mind at 10 a.m. that he didn't want to lose because he's in the middle of another train of thought, he could hurry up and jot down, and he could come back to that later. Quintilian talked about the same thing. And so there's this constructive element to writing that happens that the human mind cannot do in an unaided way. If we tried it in an unaided way, we'd simply lose the train of thought.
Yeah. Flannery O'Connor said, I don't know what I think until I see what I've written.
Totally.
Yeah. But her way of saying it's funnier than your way, but your way is more precise. I think it's really helpful.
By the way, that would be true about a lot of things.
Sure. We write what we think, then we rethink what we've written.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. This idea of things getting more and more solid, really good. And as you say, composition allows a complexity of thinking that you just can't get to,
right,
without writing. And so, and then as you also say, the complexity. We arrive at a complexity of thought that's just not possible in an oral, sort of word of mouth way of doing things.
Right.
And even, you hate to say it, but I mean, even something like Homer's epics really aren't they're plenty complex.
Right.
But there's something different about those secondary epics that were written instead of being oral.
Correct. The Aeneid has a different flavor because it doesn't actually have all the mnemonics that the bards inserted in order to help learn how to say the thing. It didn't need that because now you're going to read it.
Yeah. Okay. Now, having said all that, I want to push back just a little bit on what concerns me about your argument here is how much it sounds like the arguments of the sort of techno-optimists who look forward to a transhuman future where you use the language of, writing's like a hard drive for an external memory for our brain.
Sure.
And, it's this external circuit. I think according to somebody else, you say it's this external circuit that your brain goes out from your head out in the world.
Yep.
And I'm thinking about, the sort of wearable technologies and the earbuds that translate from Spanish real time. I mean, there's something. I'm really concerned about the technologies that say you don't have to be human anymore.
Sure.
We're going to do the thinking for you. We're going to do the remembering for you. One of my kids. He was in class and the teacher says, given what we know about the distance from the moon, blah, 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 how do we determine the circumference of the Earth? And one kid says, you Google it, And so, and this is your, description of what's great about writing sounds a lot like the descriptions of what people say what's great about AI that's going to do the thinking for you and that's going to augment human thought and take all this work off our plate.
Respond to that.
Yeah. I mean, I've never thought of writing in books as being a threat to my humanity.
Yeah.
The way and the only way AI is going to be a threat to my humanity is if I choose to be less human.
Sure.
Still.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are going to choose to be less human.
Yep.
So I think that's the difference between what you're saying and what I'm afraid of with the other. And maybe you're not afraid of what AI can do to people.
I'm not entirely sure what I'm afraid of with AI.
Yeah.
But let's backtrack.
Okay.
Humans create a lot of data. We create a lot of information. We always have created a lot of information. And when you create information, you create a problem for yourself because you have to figure out what that information means and you have to have ways of accessing it and you have to realize how it applies in this new context or not and all that kind of stuff. So here's a quick story. This Egyptian queen, you may or may not have heard of her husband, King Tut. Her name was Ankhsenamun. And she ran into a problem. King Tut died. And to be a woman in that context was a very vulnerable situation because the court in which she worked and lived and exercised what power she had meant that she needed a husband. And the people in that court wanted to go ahead and find somebody in the group that could marry her and basically marginalize her, take the title of Pharaoh for themselves, and push her to the side. And she didn't want that to happen because she's a powerful woman, and why on earth would you want to lose your place? So she did what any of us would do. She sent a letter to the king of the Hittites further up the road in Anatolia, and she said, here's the deal. I need a husband, and rumor is that you have a lot of sons. So please send me a son. And Suppiluliuma was the name of this king. Try saying that 19 times fast. Suppiluliuma thought, this must be a joke. This can't be serious. So he sent an envoy back to Egypt to say, tell me you're not joking. She wrote back another letter saying, are you seriously wasting my time? Yes, I'm being serious, and you're eating up all the bandwidth I have to actually pull this arrangement off. So hurry it up and send me this kid. And so that letter went back, and he consulted the letter, and he said, all right, well, let's get serious here. And he called to his staff, and he said, bring me back from the archive whatever relevant document would tell me that this is a good thing to do. And so they did. They went back into the archive and they unearthed a treaty that the Hittite kingdom had with Egypt. And he read it and he said, all right, this is valid. We're going to do this. Our kingdoms will be united once again as we were in the past, as this document says. And peace and prosperity will reign and it will be united again. It'll be wonderful. So he sends a prince and everything ends happily ever after. Except it didn't. The prince was murdered en route and the kingdoms went to war and it was a big mess. Most of us, as I did, would read that story with all the palace intrigue and the murder and all that kind of, that would be the dramatic part that we would focus on. But that's not what a scholar named Theo Vandenhout focused on. He was like, but wait a minute, what about that tablet? Like, here's this treaty that was written like 100 years before that this king had access to. Like, how is that possible? The answer is that these kings kept these huge libraries of material, of treaties, of various invoices, documents of all kinds that were inscribed in cuneiform on clay tablets. And these archivists had developed metadata that they could use to find things quickly and go serve it up to anybody that needed, just the same way we do today. We rely on a lot of digital tools to do that for us today, but basically those digital tools come out of library science. Mm-hmm. And so this was like a very early precursor of Google. This is like Google on literal silicon with sandal leather for the network, okay? So that's what was happening in, like 3,300 years ago. Ashurbanipal, king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, he was more ambitious about data than almost anybody else. The museum curator at the British Library referred to him as a psychopathic bookworm. The psychopath goes back to the fact that he was a brutal, horrible man. The bookworm part goes back to the fact that he was very acquisitive of all the knowledge he could find. When he conquered kingdoms to take their libraries. He enslaved people to write documents for him. When he would send, after like his army would go through, he would send men to go in and like scour all the libraries in the area and get all the tablets. And he would give them inventories like, bring me all the omens, bring me all the this, bring me all the that, and anything else you see that's great, bring that to me too. And he built a library of about 30,000 tablets that are now housed at the British Museum. And this was his effort to do what Suppiluliuma did on a small scale. He was going to do it at a big scale. And he had the same kinds of solutions. There was metadata that would help his people find the pieces that they need. There was like organizational methods, like you put these books there, you put these books here. There's like different rooms for different things and all of that kind of thing to organize all this information. The Library of Alexandria comes along several centuries later, and you have the same thing, but on an even grander scale. Nobody knows how big the Library of Alexandria was. There's like estimates that go into the several hundreds of thousands of scrolls. It was likely several 100,000, but probably not as high as some fantastical estimates would have it, but the same basic problem existed. You have way too much information for any one scholar or any group of scholars to figure out how to use. And so they created a massive 120 volume catalog of everything that was in that library, arranged by subject, by sub-subject, and by alphabetical listings of the authors, including who the author's parents might have been or their trade or things like that. Also that somebody could walk into this vast room of data, this vast room of information, and essentially, in today's lingo, like do a search prompt and find the thing that they needed. That's what's happening with AI today. And there's a direct through line, actually, from that kind of library work to what's happening with LLMs. In the 1800s, steam engines were attached to printers for the first time. And if you were printing in the time of Gutenberg or you were printing in the time of Ben Franklin, you had basically the same technology. You had a sheet-fed press with a screw press that you cranked and down came the press, and all the ink was pressed down onto that page, one sheet at a time. Now this wasn't like one page at a time. There'd be a massive sheet of paper with multiple impositions of pages, but it would still take possibly days to produce a certain size book. You could do maybe. I've seen statistics, I don't know them off the top of my head, but we're not talking about a famously productive way of printing. It still was something big, and we can come back to that if we want to. But a man, I think his name was Richard Hoe, figured out that you could take this new technology, the steam engine, and you could attach it to a new kind of printing press, a rotary press. So instead of putting one sheet in at a time, now you could take your paper towel roll that was as big as this room full of paper, and you could hook it up to this rotary press, and it would basically push or pull the paper through on this huge rotary disc that would cycle the paper and spit it out the other end, and you could produce 33,000 copies of a newspaper in an hour. And so what that meant was information overload, like an idea that if you do a Google Ngram on, you're only going to see pop up as a term of concern in the 60s or the 70s or something like that. That was a big issue way back then. Because what ends up happening is there's simply too much to know. There's too many books being produced to ever follow. There's too many research papers being published. There's too many newspapers to archive and then go back and see what was said. And so a Belgian librarian named Paul Otlet said, what if we could atomize all this data? What if we could take all this information and we could basically say there's facts, there's interpretations, there's statistics, and there's sources, and we could just kind of break everything up like that, and then we could put it in a huge card catalog, and then if you had a very advanced catalog, you could basically go find any fact that you ever wanted. And this is kind of like what people did in days when they didn't have anything better to think about. And so Paul Otlet started this project. He basically took a lot of books and he started cutting out the facts stated in one thing or another. And he started pasting them on index cards. And then he finally realized a typewriter might actually be a little bit more efficient. He and his partner created, when they first announced this project, 3 million cards of individual facts, statistics, and so on. And the idea was that you could basically call his office and one of his secretaries would say, oh, you're looking for how many people died in, whatever, the Crimean War? Great, I'll be back to you in a few minutes. And they would pull up the catalog, they would go find that fact, and they would get back on the phone, and you'd pay a little fee and you'd find out how many people died in the Crimean War. That's a really useful thing. Unfortunately, it's super inefficient. And he created, I think by the end, 15 million of these cards. He had the unfortunate timeliness of being, of living during World War I and World War II, kind of interrupted things. He ran out of funds, the whole thing fell apart. But the idea was a sound idea, at least in terms of how do you figure out how to get all this information in a consumable way that people can use. And other people began to work along similar lines. In America, there was a man named Vannevar Bush who had created basically a giant calculating machine that could figure out how, a big analog computer, it was as big as a room, and it could figure out how to do differential equations to help solve very complex math problems. We were able to bomb a lot of Germans because this guy made this thing. Because like when you send a missile up in the air, you don't know exactly where it's going to go down unless you have done the math. And humans can't really do that math very fast at all. It takes months sometimes to work out these trajectories. This machine could do it like in an afternoon or whatever. Well, he got to work on this other problem. Like, how do you get information out of this vast store of information? He was still thinking analog, and so he was like on microfiche. That's how we could do it. We could have thousands of books on microfiche, and you could like load them into your desk, and then you could have this viewer on your desk, and you could basically hit some buttons and pull some levers, and it would cycle information that you needed in front of you. And then he thought, well, you could probably automate that. And so he came up with ways of doing that. And that actually, the paper that he wrote for this, it was an article called How We Think or As We May Think. I don't remember the exact title. It was published in The Atlantic, and then Life magazine ran another version of it. That article ended up becoming like part of the seed of the internet. And the men who began to develop digital computers and the women that began to develop these systems, they read that article, and that was kind of like part of an text of that movement. Along that same lines, there was another man working. He was hired, I think it was by the Ford Foundation, named J.C.R. Licklider. He was actually the head of what became DARPA and the internet. And so he imagined computers, they weren't just to compute things, they were to talk to each other. Like, we can communicate through computers. So he wrote, at the time, the joke is something like, at the center of the intergalactic computer network or whatever, it's like two computers attached to each other. But he was talking with this other computer at a distance, and he realized, you know what? This is amazing because you could serve up information the same way. And so he was hired by the Ford Foundation to kind of like rethink library science. And he wrote a book called Libraries of the Future, 1965. And in this book, he outlined what he called a pro-cognitive system. And the idea was that this machine, digital now, this computer would basically, you would put in a prompt, and the machine would go find the data you were looking, go find the information you were looking for. It would bring it back to you, and then you would critique whether or not that was what you wanted, and then you would take the next step, which was to ask for more or to ask for it to refine it or whatever. He came up with basically the same solution that Paul Otway did, that you could basically atomize the information and have it re-sent to you in different formats. And the idea there was that it's really challenging with a traditional book, as lovely as a book is, it's really challenging to find particular information in this. Even if I have a great library catalog, I have to go find the thing on a shelf, I have to pull it off, I have to open to the index in the back, and a lot of publishers these days don't even put indexes in because they're criminals. But you find the index, then you have to go to that page, and then you have to see if that's even what you wanted. And then if it's a bad indexer, they've given you, not a lot of help anyway. And so there's what he called the passiveness of the page, that you have to be the actor on the page in order to get anything out of the page. But what if the page could actually give you itself? And so he imagined that a computer could do that. And so as these people were developing things that ultimately became the internet, that have since become generative AI, that's the thing that they were trying to solve for. How can data be delivered to you in a way that's useful? And so I think, while I get the concern about the transhumanism thing, I think transhumanists may be hijacking a meme, maybe hijacking an idea that actually goes back as long as books themselves.
Okay, but now you're talking about information giving itself to us, and there's a passivity there that's exactly what Socrates was worried about, and what you tell the story of the Egyptian gods who were debating. One says writing is a potion for memory and intelligence, and the other one says no, it's not, because all you're doing is trust in writing will make people remember things by relying on marks made by others, not on their own inner resources. So writing will make things that they have learned disappear from their minds. Yeah. Which is really interesting, which is actually not altogether wrong.
No, it's true. We don't have the sense of memory that they had then.
Yeah.
We haven't developed that skill because we don't need to. We've outsourced it to the page.
Yeah. And so I guess that's kind of where I was going. As we outsource to the page and now outsource to databases, what's left?
Yeah.
Can I tell a story?
Yeah.
There was I read an article, this was about 20 years ago, about epic poet or bards in India who could remember just huge epic poems, much bigger than the Iliad and the Odyssey put together. And so some do-gooder came along and said, I tell you what, but let's write it down so you don't forget. And
as if they were.
Yeah. And then they forgot.
Yeah.
And they can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
Like the minute it got written down, within a generation, there's nobody. There were just a few people left who could do it.
Right.
And they wrote it down, and there was nobody who could do it.
Yep.
And that makes me sad.
Yeah.
Although probably it's better to have it written down and live with the sadness that there's no more bards. Still, it seems unpoetic.
There is a loss.
Yeah.
And it certainly is unpoetic, especially when you use words like pro-cognitive system.
Yeah, right.
I think there are trade-offs that are part of the advance of any technology. And when I say advance, technology doesn't advance itself. People advance technology because people find a need for something or they address a need with something. And so...
or they
force it down your throat.
Or they force it down your throat. Or they,
sure.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of dynamics in how technologies get adopted and adapted.
Yeah.
None of us foresaw when the automobile was first invented that we would create the suburbs, for instance.
Right.
But there are consequences to development of any kind, and they can't be foreseen. Some of them can, and maybe some of those are negative, and so there are ways of addressing that built into the thing up front. But every tool has a kind of a bias, and like it's easier to kill somebody with a gun than a pillow, for instance. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a use that is valid, and people will use it for that valid use. Mm-hmm. It also will mean that people will do things with it that were not intended.
Yeah.
That's true throughout the history of the book itself. It used to be that Greek manuscripts, Roman manuscripts, were copied in a style called scripta continua. Every word was just rammed against each other on a page. So, not on a page, in a column in a scroll. And these were tight columns, they might be a couple of inches across. If you look at very old manuscripts, this is what they look like. If you look like the ancient manuscripts of the New Testament, this is what they look like. They don't have punctuation. They do not have spaces between words. The way you learned how to read that was you basically learned how to memorize the possible combinations of syllables, and a trained reader, which is why this was an ordained office in the early church, would basically be entrusted with knowing how that thing was to be read. And so they would... Let's say Paul's letter comes to you, 1 Corinthians. At that point, I guess it would just be the letter to the Corinthians. It wasn't called first until the second one came. So
it's called the Great Letter.
So the letter from Paul comes, and you get it, and it's like just a stream of letters all the way down the page, a river of letters, one person called it, a monolith of characters, another scholar called it. Your job as the reader was to basically go tease out all of those syllables, and then from memory and from the mnemonic of the thing on the page, go recite it to the congregation. And as you did that, you might have left marks for yourself. You, the reader, would add the punctuation. You would be like, this is where that thought stops. This is where this new thought begins. This is a typo. This should actually be this syllable. And so you would correct things, or you would add marks like colons, not semicolons. You would add periods, which were at that time placed in the middle of the line. And these were like readers' aids to help recite. Well, Christian monks, they said, you know what? At some point, we can't be playing fast and loose with this stuff. This is too important. We're going to formalize all these stops and starts. And there's serious consequences to this. St. Augustine talks about people who mispunctuate the opening of John's gospel end up in heresy. Because when they get the text, they get it wrong, they start putting punctuation in the wrong places, or they put the emphases on the wrong things, and they misunderstand what it's trying to say. Irenaeus, in his Against Heresies, said the same thing about the Gnostics, that they were reading St. Paul's letters outside of church. And so because they're reading outside of church, they're not hearing the approved stops and starts of the sentences. They're not hearing where one idea picks up and another idea stops. And so they create these fantastical, weird, bizarre ways of understanding Paul. And he says, if you had gone to church, you wouldn't have done that. Well, not everybody can get to church. And so the scribes said, all right, we're going to have to fix this. We're going to actually start formalizing all these punctuation marks. We're going to start in the Irish context. This is where this begins, because Syriac manuscripts, now halfway around the world, they're using a different form of language. They can't do...
She just heard Siri.
Oh, yeah, amazing. We'll get back to Siri. In Syriac, you do not have vowels in the words, and so you have to separate words in order to have other than just a jumble of characters. And so Syriac manuscripts without vowels still had distinct words. And the Irish scribes were looking at these books that they'd inherited that had come to them across the ocean, and they were looking at them and saying, what a cool idea. We could do that with Latin. And so they started with their Latin and Greek manuscripts putting spaces between words. So you have this trend of Christian scribes, monks, adding punctuation and spaces between words. That's like a very novel thing that totally changed the way people read. And it also, in a sense, ultimately democratized literature, because now people with less education could actually read those same books. And so by the time you have rising literacy and books are now, as a given, formatted that way, anybody can read the book. Now, Socrates was worried about this. Yeah. When Socrates was having this argument with Phaedrus in this famous dialogue that he had, he said, here's the problem with the book. The book says what it says, and it just says it to anybody. Any old random fool can pick up a book, and the book's going to say what it's going to say to him, and he could completely misunderstand it. And if you look at the history of Europe, there's a lot of that going on. Yeah. So I think Socrates was right, and at the same time, Socrates still actually used books, even though he said that he didn't like them. And I think we would do better to follow his practice than to follow his recommendation.
Yeah. All right, tell me about the future of the book. What are your...
Yeah, so there's one version of this story that's super sad and super dismal. And if you look at reading statistics right now, there's all kinds of reasons for despair, right? Like it's a chart that goes down. And I think that's a reasonable response, actually, to those statistics. However, I don't think it's the whole story, because if you look at Western history in total, reading started off as this tiny province of very educated people. In fact, go back even further, and it's slaves who were really educated, and rich people didn't bother to even learn how to read. They just hired people to do it, or bought them to do it. We're well past that, thank God. And people, slowly but surely, you look at rising literacy. By the time you get into the era of print, you may have 20% of a population can read. It starts to move up as books go down in price, particularly after that steam engine gets attached to the printing press. Books become ubiquitous for the first time in human history. The prices of books go down. The average person can actually now pick up and read a book. And we have this rising tide of literacy that probably reached its high watermark in the middle 20th century. And like the 80s would have been an amazing time to be in publishing. Like you couldn't do wrong in the 80s. There was 1 million independent bookstores all across the country. You could, as the phrase that said at the time, stack them high and watch them fly. That doesn't work in inventory management anymore. The end result is that the trend is down as other technologies are competing, other forms of entertainment are competing for our time and our attention. And I think there's a discouraging version of that story. Humanities departments are being closed in universities. There's less and less interest for funding that and so on. There's reasons for discouragement. At the same time, there are pockets of ridiculously enthusiastic readers. You'll find them all over. People in this room are that way. And I think we should look for these areas where there are the pockets of really enthusiastic readers and just recognize that publishing has always been a niche thing, that reading has always been kind of a minor interest. It's always something that fits into the interstitial parts of our lives anyway. It's not like most of our primary occupation. And we should celebrate those areas where it is being celebrated and work to invest our energies in those areas. Because I think that's where we're going to see the greatest return. That's where kids are going to get excited about reading again. That's like reading to our kids at night. Every night I read to my daughter, except for tonight. She's probably in bed right now, and I have not read to her. We're in the middle right now of, we just finished the Phantom Toll Booth, and we're reading Danny, Champion of the World, Roald Dahl's book. We've finished all the Roald Dahl books except for that one. He's so demented and wonderful. That's how kids get excited about reading, and that's where our investment ought to be, is like encouraging the joy of books, because they are amazing tools. Like, there is nothing that can inspire a human imagination like opening a book, which is the whole point of the Phantom Toll Booth. You know, here's this kid that's just dreary and he's dead to the universe, and he goes essentially into this game that awakens his imagination, and all of a sudden all he wants to do is like live his life in this big, glorious way. And there are books on his shelf that he can read and have these adventures in. That's what books mean to us.
Yeah.
And that's our inheritance. And we can pass that on to our kids, and we can encourage it in others and celebrate that.
Great. Thanks, Joel.
Yeah.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit Membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.